I remember that morning with perfect clarity, though it happened years ago now. The kitchen was still wrapped in that particular darkness that comes just before dawn, when the world feels suspended between night and day. Clara was sleeping upstairs, her breathing soft and steady through the ceiling above me. The children's backpacks sat lined up by the front door like small soldiers waiting for another day of school, homework folders tucked inside, lunch money counted and ready. I had always been an early riser. There was something about those quiet hours before the house stirred to life that felt like mine alone. I would sit at our small kitchen table with coffee that was too strong and mail that was usually too mundane, watching the darkness slowly give way to gray light through the window above the sink. That particular morning, I sorted through the usual collection of bills and advertisements with practiced efficiency. Electric company, credit card statement, a flyer for a new pizza place that had opened downtown. My hands moved automatically, separating what needed attention from what could be discarded immediately. Then I paused. There was an envelope near the bottom of the stack, plain white paper with no return address. My name was written across the front in handwriting that made something inside my chest tighten. Not my full name, just Nathaniel, written in careful script that seemed to carry weight beyond the simple letters. I turned the envelope over in my hands, noting how deliberately it had been sealed, how the paper felt slightly heavier than ordinary mail. I opened it slowly, though something in me already knew this moment would be significant. The letter inside was brief, written on cream-colored paper in that same careful hand. The words were simple, almost formal, but they carried an intimacy that made my breath catch. The writer spoke of remembering small things, details that only someone who had known me deeply would recall. How I used to tap my pen against my textbook when I was thinking. The way I would look out classroom windows during English class, lost in thoughts I never shared. It was signed simply, "Yours, always." I sat there holding the letter as the kitchen slowly brightened around me, feeling as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted without warning. The handwriting was unmistakable now that I allowed myself to truly see it. Bold, confident strokes that belonged to someone I had spent years trying not to think about. Someone who had occupied a space in my memory that I had carefully walled off, telling myself it was better that way. The worst part was realizing this was not the first letter. I had been receiving them for months, each one arriving without ceremony among the ordinary mail. I had been hiding them in a box in the garage, telling myself I would throw them away eventually, but never quite finding the courage to do so. Each letter had chipped away at the careful distance I had built between my present life and those dangerous memories from high school. But this letter felt different, heavier somehow. As I read it again, I could almost hear his voice speaking the words, that voice that had once called my name across crowded hallways, that had laughed with genuine warmth at jokes only the two of us understood. Damien Hale, the golden boy of our graduating class, the one everyone wanted to be close to, the one I had watched from careful distances while my heart learned the particular ache of wanting something you could never name aloud. I closed my eyes and suddenly I was 17 again, standing in the locker room after practice, pretending to organize my books while stealing glances at him as he joked with teammates. The memory came back with startling clarity, the way he moved with easy confidence, how his presence seemed to fill any room he entered, how I had memorized the sound of his laugh, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was concentrating, all those small details I had collected and treasured in secret. Upstairs, I heard Clara beginning to stir, the familiar sounds of her morning routine starting to filter through the ceiling. Soon the children would wake, and the kitchen would fill with the organized chaos of breakfast and backpack checks and hurried goodbyes. But for now, I sat alone with a letter that had arrived like a message from a life I had convinced myself was safely buried in the past. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope, my hands steadier than I felt inside. The truth I had been avoiding for decades had found me again, written in handwriting I would recognize anywhere, signed with words that suggested the story between us was far from over. My life had become a study in careful restraint, each day following patterns I had established with deliberate precision. I taught English at the same high school where I had once been a student, walking hallways that held 20 years of accumulated memories. The irony was not lost on me that I had returned to the place where it all began, though I told myself it was practical, nothing more. Good benefits, reasonable hours, summers free to spend with my family. The house Clara and I shared was modest but comfortable, filled with the evidence of a life methodically built. Framed photographs lined the mantelpiece and hallway walls, documenting family vacations to predictable destinations, anniversary dinners at restaurants we returned to year after year, first days of school with children holding signs declaring their grades. Each image captured moments of genuine contentment, though when I looked at them now, I sometimes felt like I was viewing someone else's life. Clara loved me with a steadiness that I had once found comforting. She was kind, organized, devoted to our children in ways that made me grateful every day that they had her as their mother. Our marriage worked because we had built it on shared values rather than overwhelming passion. We discussed household finances over Sunday morning coffee, planned family activities with careful consideration, maintained routines that kept our lives running smoothly. It was everything I had thought I wanted when I was young and convinced I needed to want it. But there was something hollow at the center of it all, an emptiness I could never quite name or explain. I would catch myself staring out windows during faculty meetings, my mind drifting to places I could not identify. At dinner, Clara would ask about my day, and I would provide the expected responses while some part of me remained unreachable, even to myself. I had learned to live within walls that were quiet but absolute. The high school felt different when I walked through it as a teacher rather than a student. The hallways seemed smaller, the lockers more cramped, the bulletin boards covered with announcements for events that repeated year after year with minor variations. After my last class each day, I would often linger, walking the empty corridors while my footsteps echoed off polished floors. Sometimes I found myself pausing outside the classroom where I had once sat in advanced English, remembering how I would lose myself in novels while other students passed notes or watched the clock. But it was the football field that drew me most often. I would stand at the edge of the bleachers, watching the current team practice, and remember what it had been like to be 17 and full of feelings I had no words for. I had never played football myself, but I had found reasons to be nearby during practices, telling myself I was there to study or wait for rides home. The truth was more complicated, centered around one particular player who seemed to command attention without effort. Damian Hale had been everything I was not. Loud where I was quiet, confident where I was uncertain, magnetic in ways that drew people into his orbit without him seeming to try. He was the quarterback, the one coaches relied on, the one other players looked to for leadership. He dated cheerleaders with practiced ease, drove a car that other students admired, carried himself with the assurance of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. I had watched him from careful distances, memorizing details I told myself meant nothing. The way he would clap teammates on the shoulder after good plays. How he could make even the most serious coaches smile with some perfectly timed comment. The particular intensity he brought to practices, as though football mattered more to him than he wanted to admit. I had convinced myself that my fascination was simple admiration, the bookish kid drawn to everything he could never be. But there had been moments, brief and probably imagined, when I thought I caught him looking back. Times when our eyes would meet across the cafeteria and hold for just a second longer than seemed accidental. Once, he had asked to borrow a pen during chemistry class, and when he handed it back, his fingers had brushed mine with what felt like intentional care. I had replayed that moment for weeks afterward, analyzing every detail until I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Now, standing on the same field 20 years later, I realized those memories had never really left me. They had been waiting quietly in some corner of my consciousness, preserved with a clarity that surprised me. The letters had awakened something I thought I had successfully buried, a suspicion that Damian Hale had never fully disappeared from my orbit, even when I had spent decades convincing myself he belonged to a past I had outgrown. The current players would occasionally glance in my direction, probably wondering why their English teacher lingered at the edge of their practice space. I would nod politely and eventually walk back to my car, driving home to where Clara was preparing dinner and our children were finishing homework at the kitchen table. The transition from memory to present reality felt jarring, like stepping between two different worlds that somehow both belonged to me. At night, after the children were asleep and Clara was reading beside me in bed, I would lie awake thinking about those letters hidden in the garage. Each one had been carefully crafted, written by someone who remembered details about me that I had forgotten about myself. Someone who had been paying attention during those years when I thought I was invisible, when I believed my feelings were my secret alone to carry. The most unsettling realization was how much I looked forward to checking the mail each morning, scanning for envelopes without return addresses. Part of me wanted the letters to stop, to let me return to the quiet stability I had worked so hard to build. But another part, a part one was afraid to examine too closely, hoped they would continue. Because for the first time in years, someone seemed to see past the careful roles I had constructed, reaching toward the person I had been before I learned to live within such deliberate boundaries. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements. I almost missed it entirely, my hands moving automatically through the stack of mail until the formal weight of expensive paper made me pause. The envelope was cream-colored, embossed with gold lettering that announced itself as something significant before I even read the words. 20-year class reunion, it declared in elegant script. The dates, location, and time were listed with the kind of careful formality that suggested months of planning by some dedicated committee. At the bottom, in smaller print, a line about reconnecting with old friends and celebrating how far we had all come. I stared at the invitation for a long time, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. The timing felt deliberately cruel, arriving so soon after that morning when I had sat in the kitchen with Damien's letter in my hands. For weeks now, I had been carrying the weight of those hidden words, the knowledge that someone from my carefully buried past was reaching toward me across 20 years of silence. And now this invitation, as though the universe was conspiring to force a confrontation I had spent decades avoiding. Clara found me standing in the kitchen, still holding the invitation, when she returned from her afternoon errands. She read it over my shoulder, her presence warm and familiar behind me, and I felt the sharp contrast between the life I had built and the memories that were suddenly demanding attention. She was enthusiastic in the way that came naturally to her, already imagining the evening as an opportunity for connection and nostalgia. She said it would be good for me to see old friends, to remember who I had been before the responsibilities of adulthood settled around us. She reminded me that I rarely talked about high school, that she had always been curious about that part of my life. Her excitement felt genuine and innocent, which somehow made everything worse. I wanted to tell her that some parts of the past were better left undisturbed, that I had chosen not to talk about high school for reasons she could not understand. But how could I explain the letters without revealing their contents, or their effect on me, or the way they had awakened feelings I thought I had successfully buried? Instead, I nodded and agreed that perhaps it would be interesting to see how everyone had turned out. The weeks leading up to the reunion passed with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. I found myself thinking about Damien more frequently, wondering if he would attend, whether he looked the same, how I would react if I saw him again. The letters had continued arriving, each one carefully crafted and deeply personal, written by someone who remembered details about me that I had forgotten about myself. Someone who had been watching more carefully than I had ever realized. Clara helped me choose what to wear, selecting a dark suit that she said made me look distinguished, professional, like the man I had become rather than the uncertain boy I had been. She straightened my tie and brushed imaginary lint from my shoulders, treating the evening like any other social obligation that required the right presentation. Her care felt both touching and heartbreaking, evidence of how much she loved the version of me she knew. The high school gymnasium had been decorated with streamers in our class colors and tables covered with white linens that could not quite disguise the institutional feeling of the space. Someone had set up a display of photographs from our senior year, and I found myself studying those images with new eyes, looking for evidence of things I had missed or misunderstood at the time. There we all were at 18, frozen in moments that had seemed so important then, our futures stretching ahead of us like blank pages waiting to be written. The room filled gradually with faces that were familiar but changed, weathered by 20 years of living. Former classmates clustered in conversations that felt both natural and performed, comparing notes about careers and marriages and children with the particular intensity of people trying to summarize entire decades in brief exchanges. I moved through these interactions with practiced politeness, participating in the expected rituals while some part of me remained alert, scanning the room for one particular face. Then I saw him, standing near the far wall in conversation with a group of former teammates. Damen looked older, of course, his hair now flecked with gray and his face carrying lines that spoke of years I knew nothing about. But his presence was unmistakable, that quality that had always made him the center of attention without seeming to try. He stood taller than I remembered, his shoulders still broad beneath a navy jacket that looked expensive and carefully chosen. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and in that instant, the careful distance I had maintained between past and present collapsed entirely. The look that passed between us was charged with recognition that went far beyond the simple acknowledgement of former classmates. It was the look of two people who had unfinished business, who carried shared memories that neither had forgotten despite years of silence. He did not approach me immediately, and I was grateful for that small mercy. Instead, we moved through the evening in careful orbits, aware of each other's location without making direct contact. I participated in conversations about careers and families, answered questions about my teaching with responses that felt automatic and distant. All the while, I was acutely conscious of where Damen stood, who he was talking to, whether he was watching me with the same careful attention I was giving him. Later in the evening, when the formal program had ended and people were beginning to drift toward the exits, I stepped outside for air that felt less heavy than the atmosphere inside the gymnasium. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look stark and unfamiliar. I stood by my car, fumbling with keys that seemed to have grown heavier in my hands. It was only when I reached home and hung my jacket in the closet that I discovered the letter. It had been slipped into the inside pocket so carefully that I had not felt its presence during the drive home. The envelope was smaller than the others, containing just a few lines written in that familiar hand. The message was brief but unmistakable, acknowledging that we had seen each other, that the careful distance we had both maintained was no longer sustainable. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing my dress shirt and tie, holding this latest letter while Clara slept peacefully beside me. The truth I had been avoiding for decades had found me again, written in handwriting I would recognize anywhere, delivered with a boldness that suggested the time for pretending was finally over. Whatever had been building between us through months of careful correspondence was about to become something more immediate, more dangerous, more real than I felt prepared to handle. Damen reached out in ways that felt both deliberate and careful, as though he understood that too much contact too quickly would send me retreating back into the safe boundaries I had spent 20 years constructing. The first phone call came 3 days after the reunion, while I was grading papers in my empty classroom after the final bell had released students into their afternoon lives. His voice on the phone carried the same warm confidence I remembered, but there was something underneath it now, a quality that suggested depth I had never been allowed to see when we were 17. He said he had been thinking about our brief encounter at the reunion, how strange it had felt to see me after so many years. He wondered if I might want to get coffee sometime, to catch up properly without the noise and performance of a crowded gymnasium. I agreed before I could analyze the wisdom of that decision, my response coming from some part of me that had been waiting for this invitation longer than I wanted to admit. We arranged to meet the following Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop in the next town over, far enough from our old neighborhood that we were unlikely to encounter anyone who might recognize us and turn our conversation into community gossip. The coffee shop was one of those deliberately cozy places with mismatched furniture and local artwork covering every available wall space. Damien was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of him, having somehow remembered that I preferred my coffee black. He looked different in casual clothes, more relaxed than he had at the reunion, though I noticed he had chosen a seat that allowed him to see the entrance and most of the room from where he sat today. We started with the expected topics, filling in the broad outlines of the years that had passed since graduation. He told me about college on a football scholarship, about the knee injury that had ended those dreams sooner than expected, about the business he had eventually built from nothing. I shared the safer details of my life, teaching and marriage and children, presenting the version of myself that fit comfortably into ordinary conversation. But as the afternoon stretched on, something shifted between us. The careful politeness gave way to something more honest, more recognition of who we had actually been to each other all those years ago. He began to speak about high school in ways that surprised me, describing experiences that bore little resemblance to the confident, effortless success I had observed from my careful distance. He told me that those years had been suffocating in ways he had never been able to admit at the time. Behind all the bravado and popularity, he had been a boy desperate for real connection but terrified of letting anyone see past the image everyone expected him to maintain. The pressure to be the golden boy, the star athlete, the one who never showed doubt or uncertainty, had been crushing in ways that no one around him had understood or even noticed. His teammates, he said, had been friends in the way that sports teams create friendship, bound together by shared goals and mutual dependence, but not necessarily by deeper understanding. His family had been proud of his achievements, but had also come to expect them, making every success feel less like celebration and more like meeting minimum requirements. Even the girls he had dated, he admitted with something that sounded like regret, had been attracted to the image rather than anything real underneath it. The confession that followed caught me completely off guard. He said that I had been the one person in high school who had seemed to see him as something other than a collection of accomplishments and expectations. That my presence in the margins of his world had felt like the only genuine attention he received, even though we had barely spoken directly during those years. He had noticed me watching him, he said, and instead of feeling scrutinized or judged, he had felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and comforting. The letters, he explained, had been his way of staying connected to that feeling, to the memory of someone who had known him before he learned to disappear completely behind the roles that adult life had handed him. Writing to me had become a lifeline, a way of remembering that there had once been a version of himself that felt real and unguarded, even if he had never been brave enough to show it openly. I listened to all of this with a growing sense of vertigo, as though the careful story I had told myself about our shared past was being rewritten in real time. All those moments I had convinced myself were imagined or misinterpreted suddenly took on new weight and meaning. The glances across crowded rooms, the careful way he had returned my borrowed pen, the times when he had seemed to linger near my locker longer than coincidence would explain, all of it had been real in ways I had been too afraid to believe. We began meeting regularly after that first coffee, finding excuses to spend time together that felt innocent enough to justify to ourselves and anyone who might ask. A quick lunch between his business appointments and my afternoon classes. An evening walk through the park where we had both played as children, talking about books I had recommended or memories we were finally brave enough to share. These encounters felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. The conversations stretched longer each time we met, full of unfinished sentences and comfortable silences that spoke of deeper recognition. We talked about the books we had been reading, the music we listened to when no one else was around, the dreams we had carried, and the ones we had abandoned along the way. He had a thoughtfulness that the boy I remembered had never been allowed to display, an intelligence that went far beyond the athletic achievements that had defined him in high school. I began to feel alive in ways I had not experienced in decades, as though parts of myself that had been dormant were suddenly awakening. The careful routines that had structured my life for so long began to feel constraining, almost suffocating. Coming home to dinner conversations about homework schedules and weekend plans felt like returning to a life that belonged to someone else, someone who had been playing a role so long he had forgotten it was a performance. Clara began to notice the change in me, though she could not have identified its source. She commented that I seemed distracted lately, more inclined to stare out windows during conversations or linger outside after dinner instead of settling into our usual evening routines. She asked if everything was all right at work, whether I was feeling stressed about something I had not shared with her. Her concern was genuine and loving, which somehow made everything worse. The weight of living two different lives became almost unbearable. During the day, I would find myself counting hours until I could see Damen again, looking forward to conversations that felt more real than anything else in my carefully constructed world. But then I would return home to my family, to Clara's gentle questions about my day and my children's excited stories about school and friends, and the guilt would settle over me like a physical weight. I began to understand that I was approaching some kind of crossroads, though I could not yet see clearly what my choices were or where they might lead. The truth that was rising inside me felt like a tide that refused to retreat, growing stronger each day despite my attempts to contain it within safe boundaries. Something fundamental was shifting in the careful balance I had maintained for 20 years, and I was no longer certain I could control where that shift would take me. The most dangerous realization was how much I looked forward to those stolen hours with Damen, how alive and authentic I felt in his presence compared to the muted existence I had been accepting as normal for so long. For the first time since I was 17, I was remembering what it felt like to be seen completely, to be valued for who I actually was rather than the roles I had learned to play. And that memory, once awakened, was proving impossible to ignore or forget again. The evening that changed everything started like so many others we had shared over the past few weeks. Damen had suggested dinner at a small restaurant on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where we could talk without worrying about familiar faces or curious glances. We had fallen into these careful patterns, finding ways to spend time together that felt almost normal, almost innocent, even as something deeper grew between us with each conversation. Dinner had stretched longer than usual, our conversation moving through topics that felt increasingly personal and honest. He told me about the loneliness that had followed him through his adult years, how success in business had never filled the emptiness he carried. I found myself sharing things I had never spoken aloud before, about the weight of living a life that felt half real, about the growing sense that I had been sleepwalking through my own existence for far too long. By the time we left the restaurant, the sun had set completely, leaving the world wrapped in that particular darkness that makes everything feel more intimate and dangerous. Damen had driven separately, as we always did, but his car would not start when he turned the key. The engine made a grinding sound that spoke of expensive repairs and inconvenient timing. I offered to drive him home without thinking about what that might mean, what proximity in the confined space of my car might do to the careful distance we had been maintaining. He accepted with what seemed like relief, though I noticed he was quieter than usual as we pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty road that led toward his neighborhood. The drive should have taken 20 minutes, but somehow we found ourselves taking a longer route, neither of us acknowledging the detour or the way we both seemed reluctant for the evening to end. We talked quietly about nothing in particular, our voices lower than necessary in the darkness of the car, as though we were sharing secrets that required whispered delivery. It was Damen who suggested we stop, pointing to a small park we were passing where street lamps cast pools of yellow light across empty benches and walking paths. He said he was not ready to go home yet, that he wanted to continue our conversation somewhere we could sit and really talk. I pulled into the parking area without questioning the wisdom of extending an evening that already felt charged with unspoken possibility. We walked to a bench positioned beneath one of the street lamps, the light creating a small circle of visibility in the surrounding darkness. The conversation that had flowed so easily in the restaurant became more hesitant here, punctuated by silences that felt heavy with things neither of us knew how to say. We sat closer than we needed to, our shoulders almost touching, the space between us feeling electric with potential. He began to speak about the letters again, how writing them had been both a torment and a relief, a way of staying connected to feelings he had carried for 20 years but never been able to express. He said that seeing me at the reunion had made him realize that some truths could not be buried forever, that the careful distance he had maintained from his own heart was no longer sustainable. I listened with growing awareness that we were approaching some kind of precipice, a moment that would change everything between us regardless of how we chose to navigate it. The air felt thick with possibility and danger, with the weight of decades of unspoken longing finally demanding acknowledgement. Then, without warning or preamble, he reached for my hand. The touch was electric in ways I had not anticipated, a spark that seemed to travel through my entire body and awaken every nerve ending simultaneously. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from years of working with his hands, and they fit against mine with a familiarity that suggested this moment had been inevitable all along. I did not pull away, though some part of my mind was screaming warnings about lines being crossed and lives being irrevocably altered. In that instant, everything I had been trying not to understand about myself and about us suddenly became crystal clear. The letters had not been the gesture of a former classmate seeking casual reconnection. They had been love letters, written by someone who had been holding on to me across 20 years of separation, someone who had never forgotten the connection we had shared even when I had convinced myself it existed only in my imagination. The quiet weight of longing that I had been carrying for decades crashed over me like a tide, washing away all the careful rationalizations and denials I had constructed to protect myself from this truth. I realized that I had been holding back my own heart for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to want something with this kind of desperate intensity. We sat like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, holding hands beneath the street lamp while the world around us remained obliviously quiet. Neither of us spoke, as though putting words to what was happening might somehow break the spell or force us to confront implications we were not yet ready to handle. When I finally drove him home, the silence in the car felt different than it had before, charged with acknowledgement rather than avoidance. He squeezed my hand once more before getting out, a gesture that felt like both promise and goodbye, though I could not have said which one it was meant to be. The drive to my own house passed in a blur of racing thoughts and pounding heartbeat. I sat in my driveway for several minutes after arriving, trying to compose myself enough to walk through my front door and resume the role of husband and father without revealing the seismic shift that had just occurred in my understanding of myself. Clara was already asleep when I climbed the stairs, her breathing soft, and even in the darkness of our bedroom. I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror above the sink, trying to recognize the man looking back at me. My face appeared the same as it had that morning, but something fundamental had changed behind my eyes. Some barrier had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. I found myself whispering words I had never said aloud before, words that felt both like liberation and betrayal as they left my lips. I love him. The admission hung in the air of the small bathroom like a confession that changed everything, a truth that made all my careful constructions suddenly feel like elaborate lies I had been telling not just to the world, but to myself. Standing there in the darkness, with my sleeping family just beyond the thin bathroom door, I finally understood that there would be no going back from this moment. The careful life I had built was about to come apart, not because of anything Damien had done, but because of a truth about myself that I could no longer deny or contain. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt completely, terrifyingly alive. The weeks that followed that evening beneath the street lamp became an exercise in carefully managed deception that grew more exhausting with each passing day. I moved through my regular routines with what I hoped appeared to be normalcy, teaching my classes, attending faculty meetings, helping with homework at the kitchen table, but everything felt hollow and performative, as though I were watching someone else live my life from a great distance. The weight of carrying two different versions of myself became almost unbearable. During school hours, I would find myself staring out classroom windows, counting the hours until I could see Damien again, anticipating conversations that felt more real than anything else in my carefully ordered world. But then I would return home to Clara's gentle questions about my day and my children's excited stories about friends and tests and weekend plans, and the guilt would settle over me like a physical presence I could not shake. Clara began to notice the change in ways that both touched and terrified me. She would catch me standing at the kitchen window long after dinner had been cleared away, staring into the darkness of our backyard as though I were searching for something I could not name. She commented on how distracted I seemed during conversations, how I would nod and respond appropriately, but with a distance that suggested my attention was elsewhere entirely. She asked if I was feeling well, whether something at work was troubling me, if there were problems I had not shared with her. Her concern was genuine and patient, offered without accusation or demand, which somehow made it worse than anger would have been. I found myself creating elaborate explanations for my distraction, inventing professional pressures and personal anxieties that sounded plausible but felt like additional layers of betrayal. The most difficult moments came when she would reach for me in the darkness of our bedroom, seeking the physical intimacy that had been a comfortable part of our marriage for so many years. I could not refuse without raising questions I was not prepared to answer, but participating felt like a violation of something I could not define. I began to understand that I was living in a kind of limbo that was sustainable for neither of us, though she did not yet know why. My meetings with Damien continued, but they had taken on a different quality since that evening when he had reached for my hand. There was an acknowledgement between us now, an understanding that something fundamental had shifted, but also a careful restraint that suggested we both recognized how dangerous this territory had become. We talked around the edges of what was happening, speaking in careful language that carried deeper meaning without stating it directly. He seemed to understand the conflict I was carrying, the weight of obligations and commitments that made any forward movement feel like betrayal. He never pressed for more than I could give, never demanded declarations or decisions, but I could see in his eyes that he was waiting, that this suspended state was not sustainable for him either. We were both approaching some kind of deadline, though neither of us had spoken it aloud. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived with the quiet inevitability of something that had been building for weeks. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of crisp autumn night that usually brought me comfort and peace. I had been standing at the kitchen sink, ostensibly washing dishes, but actually lost in thoughts of conversations I had shared with Damien that afternoon, when Clara approached from behind and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. She asked if I wanted to talk about whatever was troubling me, her voice carrying the particular patience that comes from loving someone for a long time and recognizing when they are struggling with something beyond ordinary stress. I turned to face her, and something in my expression must have told her that this conversation was going to be different from the careful dance we had been performing for weeks. She asked me directly if there was someone else. The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I could either cross or retreat from, and I realized in that moment that I was tired of retreating, tired of the elaborate performance that had been consuming so much energy. I could not lie to her, not when she was looking at me with such honest concern, not when she deserved better than the half-truths I had been offering. The silence that followed stretched between us, devastating in its honesty. I watched understanding dawn in her eyes, saw the precise moment when she realized that her suspicions had been correct, that the distance she had been feeling was not imagined or temporary. Her face did not collapse into anger or accusation, as I might have expected. Instead, it folded with a quiet hurt that was somehow worse than rage would have been. She asked quietly if I loved this other person, and I found myself nodding before I could consider the wisdom of such complete honesty. She asked if it was someone she knew, and I told her it was someone from high school, someone who had recently reappeared in my life. She did not ask for details or demand explanations. Instead, she simply stood there absorbing the information, processing the implications of 20 years of marriage suddenly thrown into question. The conversation that followed was brief and devastating in its restraint. She said she had suspected something, but had hoped she was wrong, that she had noticed changes in me that went deeper than ordinary distraction or stress. She asked what I wanted to do, whether this was something I thought would pass or something that required larger decisions. Her composure throughout this exchange was both admirable and heartbreaking, evidence of the kind of person she was and the kind of marriage we had built together. I told her I did not know what came next, but that I could not continue living the way we had been, in this state of careful pretense that was fair to none of us. She nodded as though she had been expecting this answer, though I could see the effort it took for her to maintain her calm demeanor. She said she needed time to think, to decide what this meant for our family and our future. Then she went upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the wreckage of everything I had spent 20 years building. The next evening, I drove to the high school football field where Damen and I had arranged to meet, though I could not have said who had suggested this particular location or why it seemed appropriate for the conversation we needed to have. The bleachers were empty, the field dark except for distant streetlights that cast long shadows across the grass, where we had both spent so many afternoons as teenagers, though from very different vantage points. He was waiting for me at the edge of the field, standing in almost the exact spot where I used to watch him practice 20 years earlier. The symmetry felt deliberate and significant, as though we were completing some circle that had been left open all this time. He did not speak immediately when I approached, seeming to understand that I had reached some kind of decision point that would determine everything that followed. I told him about my conversation with Clara, about the quiet devastation of admitting truths that could not be taken back. I explained that I could no longer live in the suspended state we had been occupying, that the weight of dual loyalties was destroying everyone involved, including myself. The choice, as I understood it, was to walk away forever and try to repair what could be salvaged from my marriage, or to step into something real and honest at last, regardless of the cost. He listened without interruption, his presence steady and patient in the darkness beside me. When I finished speaking, he said quietly that he would understand whichever choice I made, that he had waited 20 years and could wait longer if necessary, but that he hoped I would choose the truth we had both been carrying, even if it meant unraveling everything else. Standing there in the darkness of the football field where it had all begun, I finally chose truth over safety, honesty over obligation, the possibility of real love over the comfort of careful pretense. It was the most terrifying and liberating decision I had ever made, and I knew it would change everything in ways I could not yet imagine or control. The morning I left was quiet in the way that significant moments often are, marked not by drama or grand gestures, but by the careful deliberation of someone who has finally stopped running from the truth. I sat at our kitchen table as dawn broke slowly through the window, the same table where I had first opened Damien's letter all those months ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. My wedding ring sat beside Clara's on the counter, two small circles of gold that had once symbolized promises we both believed we could keep forever. We had removed them together the night before, not in anger but with the solemn recognition that some commitments, however well-intentioned, cannot survive the weight of fundamental truth. Clara had been gracious even in her pain, understanding in ways that made the leaving both easier and infinitely more difficult. The suitcase by the front door contained the essentials I would need for whatever came next, though I had no clear vision of what that future might look like. There were arrangements to be made, lawyers to consult, custody agreements to negotiate, all the practical machinery that accompanies the dismantling of a life built over 20 years. But those details felt distant and manageable compared to the immediate task that occupied my attention this morning. I was writing a letter to my children. The words came slowly, each sentence requiring careful consideration because I knew they would carry the weight of explanation for years to come. I wanted them to understand that my leaving had nothing to do with them, that my love for them remained absolute and unchanged. I tried to explain that sometimes adults discover truths about themselves that require difficult choices, that choosing honesty over comfort was not a rejection of everything that had come before, but an acknowledgement that some parts of life require courage even when that courage causes pain. I wrote that they would always be the best thing I had ever done, that watching them grow into the remarkable people they were becoming had been the greatest privilege of my life. I promised that distance would not diminish my devotion, that I would always be available when they needed me, that this change in our family structure did not represent an end but a different kind of beginning. The letter took nearly an hour to write, though it filled only 2 pages. Every word felt consequential, every phrase scrutinized for accuracy and kindness. I folded it carefully and left it on the kitchen table where they would find it when they woke up, beside a note for Clara that simply said thank you for 20 years of love and patience, and that I was sorry it had taken me so long to understand who I was supposed to be. Outside, I could see the faint glow of headlights in our driveway. Damien had been waiting there for nearly an hour, patient and undemanding, giving me the time I needed to complete this transition properly. We had talked about this morning many times over the past few weeks, planning not just the logistics of my leaving, but the emotional weight of stepping away from everything familiar into something completely unknown. He had never pressured me to move faster than I was ready to move, never demanded certainty when I was still finding my way toward it. His patience throughout this process had been both steadying and humbling, evidence of someone who understood that love sometimes requires waiting, that the most important decisions cannot be rushed or forced. I stood at the front door for several minutes, my hand on the handle, breathing deeply as though I were preparing to enter a new world rather than simply step outside into the familiar suburban street where I had lived for so many years. In many ways, that was exactly what I was doing. The man who had lived in this house, who had maintained these careful routines and responsibilities, was being left behind. Who I would become beyond this threshold remained to be discovered. The air outside was crisp with early autumn, carrying the scent of leaves beginning to turn and the promise of seasons changing. I walked slowly to Damien's car, carrying my suitcase and the weight of everything I was choosing to leave behind, everything I was choosing to embrace. He watched me approach through the windshield, his expression gentle and patient, offering neither celebration nor consolation, but simply presence. I placed my suitcase in the back seat and settled into the passenger seat beside him, suddenly aware that this was the first time in 20 years that I had no predetermined destination, no schedule to maintain, no role to perform. The freedom felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of an ocean whose depths I could not fathom. Damien reached over and took my hand, the same gesture that had changed everything between us that night beneath the street lamp. This time, I did not hesitate or calculate consequences. I simply accepted the warmth of his touch and the promise it represented, whatever that promise might ultimately become. As we pulled out of the driveway, I turned back once to look at the house where I had lived for so many years, where my children still slept peacefully, where Clara was probably already awake and preparing for a day that would be different from every day that had come before. The sight filled me with both profound sadness and quiet relief, the complex emotions of someone who has finally chosen truth over safety. The sound of the car door closing behind me felt like the end of one story and the beginning of another, carrying both the weight of loss and the fragile promise of love finally allowed to live without apology or disguise. As we drove through the sleeping neighborhood toward whatever future awaited us, I breathed deeply and felt, for the first time in decades, completely and authentically alive.